Barron Trump had always kept a low profile, but that changed one evening at an exclusive charity gala in Beverly Hills. The event, filled with Hollywood elites and political figures, was meant to be a night of glamour and goodwill. However, things took an unexpected turn when Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director, took the stage to deliver a speech. Eastwood, known for his bluntness, was reminiscing about his Hollywood days when his tone suddenly shifted. He made a passing remark about the younger generation, calling them soft, pampered, and clueless about real hard work. Then, with a smirk, he added, "Even the former first kid, Barron Trump, probably grew up thinking a tough day was running out of Wi-Fi in a golden penthouse." The crowd chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment while whispers spread across the room. Barron, seated at a round table with a few other guests, simply lifted his glass of sparkling water and took a slow sip. Unlike the others who squirmed in their seats, he seemed unfazed. Then, in a move that caught everyone off guard, Barron rose from his chair. A hush fell over the audience as he walked toward the stage. At 6'7", he towered over most of the attendees, his presence commanding yet composed. Eastwood watched him with an arched brow, seemingly amused. Taking the microphone from the podium, Barron looked out at the crowd, then turned to the legendary actor. His voice, deep yet calm, carried through the room. "Mr. Eastwood, I respect everything you've done for cinema and American culture. Your legacy is undeniable," he began, earning nods from several audience members. "But let's clear something up." The room tensed with anticipation. "Hard work isn't about where you come from," Barron continued. "It's about how you carry yourself, the values you uphold, and the way you treat others. My parents taught me that real strength isn't measured by how loud you are, but by how well you handle moments like this." Some murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eastwood leaned back slightly, a flicker of intrigue in his eyes. "I may have grown up in a unique environment, but that doesn't mean I don't understand discipline, responsibility, or respect," Barron went on. "And while some might think I've had it easy, I believe real toughness is staying dignified even when others try to take cheap shots at you." A few scattered claps began, then grew into full applause. Eastwood, to his credit, chuckled and gave a nod of acknowledgement. "Fair enough, kid," he said, tipping an imaginary hat. Barron handed the microphone back, returned to his seat, and resumed his drink as if nothing had happened. But in that moment, everyone in the room knew. They had just witnessed something truly epic. As the applause settled, the atmosphere in the room shifted. What had started as an awkward moment of tension had turned into an undeniable display of confidence and class. Barron had not only defended himself but had done so with a level of composure that left even the most seasoned figures in the room impressed. Clint Eastwood, ever the embodiment of old-school toughness, smirked as he adjusted his stance at the podium. "Well, I gotta say," he drawled, his gravelly voice carrying a hint of amusement, "you handled that better than most grown men I've seen in this town." Laughter rippled through the crowd, followed by a second round of applause. Even those who had initially laughed at Eastwood's jab now found themselves nodding in approval of Barron's measured response. The moment had transformed into something bigger than just a rebuttal. It was a defining moment that many wouldn't soon forget. Barron simply offered a polite nod in response, not basking in the moment, but instead remaining as composed as ever. He didn't need to revel in the applause or seek validation. His words had done enough. After the event, as guests mingled and conversations buzzed, several influential figures approached Barron to shake his hand, offering words of admiration. "That was impressive," one director said. "You handled yourself like a pro," a well-known politician added. Even a few media personalities, always on the lookout for controversy, seemed pleasantly surprised by how he had diffused the situation. Later that night, as Barron prepared to leave, Clint Eastwood himself approached him near the exit. "Kid," he said, his piercing eyes studying the young man in front of him, "you've got a presence. Keep that up, and you'll do just fine in this world." Barron shook his hand, a firm yet respectful grip. "Thank you, sir," he said, simply, And with that, he stepped out into the night, leaving behind a room full of people who had just witnessed history in the making. As Barron stepped outside into the cool night air, the flashes of cameras flickered in the distance. Paparazzi, always eager for a story, had caught wind of the moment inside and were waiting for any reaction. But true to his nature, Barron remained composed, offering nothing more than a calm, confident stride as he made his way toward the waiting black SUV. Inside the vehicle, his phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages poured in from friends, family, and even a few public figures who had caught wind of his exchange with Eastwood. Some congratulated him, others expressed admiration, and a few even joked that he should consider a career in politics. As the car pulled away, Barron glanced at his reflection in the tinted window, his expression unreadable. He wasn't someone who sought the spotlight, but tonight had proven that when the moment called for it, he could handle himself with grace and authority. The next morning, headlines exploded across social media and news outlets. Barron Trump's epic clapback at Clint Eastwood dominated trending topics. Clips of the moment racked up millions of views overnight, with commentators analyzing his response from every angle. Some praised him for his maturity, while others speculated about what this meant for his future. Even Clint Eastwood himself addressed the moment in a brief interview. "The kid's got guts," he admitted with a smirk. "I can respect that." As for Barron, he didn't issue any follow-up statements, didn't engage in any online chatter. He simply went on with his life as usual, letting the world talk while he stayed focused on his own path. And in doing so, he had unknowingly solidified his place in a new narrative, not just as the son of a former president, but as a man who, in one night, had earned the respect of even the toughest legends. Days passed, but the moment refused to fade. Barron Trump's name was now being mentioned in circles far beyond political and celebrity gossip. Pundits debated whether his poised response signaled a future in public life, while young people on social media hailed him as an example of quiet confidence. Memes flooded the internet, some humorous, some admiring, but all acknowledging one thing: Barron had handled himself like a pro. Despite the media frenzy, Barron remained silent. No interviews, no statements, just a business-as-usual approach that only fueled the intrigue. That restraint, that ability to let his actions speak louder than any social media post, was something even seasoned public figures struggled to master. Then, one evening, a sleek black envelope arrived at Trump Tower, delivered by a private courier. It bore only a handwritten note inside. "Respect is earned, not given. You earned it. C.E. Clint Eastwood's initials." Barron read the note once, then folded it carefully and tucked it away. He didn't need to post about it, didn't need to frame it for the world to see. He understood what it meant. The world had seen him as a quiet figure, a boy growing up in the shadows of power. But that night at the gala had shown them something different. Barron Trump wasn't just a name. In history, he was writing his own story. And whether he liked it or not, the world would be watching. In the weeks that followed, Barron Trump's moment with Clint Eastwood became the stuff of legend. Late-night talk show hosts debated it, influencers dissected his body language, and political commentators speculated on what it meant for his future. The general consensus? He had handled himself with the kind of poise and maturity that was rare, especially for someone his age. Despite the media whirlwind, Barron went about his life as usual. He attended events when necessary, focused on his studies, and avoided the spotlight as much as he could. But something had changed. Everywhere he went, there were whispers, respectful nods, and the occasional stranger who stopped him just to say, "Well done." One afternoon, as he walked into a quiet New York cafe, he noticed an older man seated in the corner, sipping black coffee and reading a newspaper. It was Clint Eastwood. Their eyes met briefly, and Eastwood smirked. With a slight nod, he gestured to the empty seat across from him. Barron hesitated only for a second before sitting down. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Eastwood folded his newspaper and looked at him. "You know, kid, I've seen a lot of people crack under pressure," he said, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone. "But you? You stood your ground without losing your cool. That's rare. Barron met his gaze. I was just raised to handle things with dignity, he replied simply. Eastwood chuckled. That's a good answer. He took a sip of his coffee before leaning forward slightly. Listen, I didn't mean anything personal that night. I just like to push buttons, see how people react. It tells you a lot about them. Barron nodded. I figured as much. The veteran actor studied him for a moment before nodding approvingly. You got a good head on your shoulders. Keep it that way. The world's gonna have a lot of opinions about you, but at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is how you carry yourself. Barron took a moment to let the words sink in. I appreciate that, Mr. Eastwood. A rare smile flickered across Eastwood's face. Call me Clint. They exchanged a firm handshake before parting ways. No cameras, no publicity. Just a quiet moment of mutual respect. As Barron stepped back out onto the busy New York streets, he realized something. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone. The world could speculate all they wanted, but in the end, his actions would always speak louder than any headline. And that was all that mattered. As Barron walked through the bustling streets of New York, he replayed the conversation in his mind. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a Hollywood legend. He was a man who had seen and done it all. For him to extend that kind of respect meant something. It wasn't about fame or politics. It was about character. The encounter stayed with him not because it changed anything, but because it confirmed what he already knew. People would always test him, but his response was what defined him. Meanwhile, the media frenzy hadn't slowed. Talk of Barron's poised response at the gala had snowballed into something bigger. Articles speculated about whether he would enter politics, business, or perhaps even Hollywood. Some called him the last dignified figure of his generation. Others insisted that his silence was his greatest weapon, making him unpredictable in a world where everyone else was desperate for attention. One night, as he sat in his room scrolling through the latest headlines, his mother, Melania, walked in. She glanced at his phone and smirked. They always have something to say, don't they? Barron sighed. Yeah, but it's just noise. Melania nodded approvingly. Good. Never let the noise distract you. She sat beside him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she said, Your father saw the clip. Barron raised an eyebrow. And? A small smile played on her lips. He said, That's my boy. Barron chuckled. He knew his father well enough to understand that was high praise. Weeks passed and the story slowly began to fade from the headlines, but something had shifted in the way people looked at him. No longer was he just the quiet son of a former president. He was something else now, an enigma, a figure who had held his own in front of a legend and come out of it not just unscathed but respected. One evening, as he scrolled through his messages, he came across a text from an unknown number. You ever think about stepping into the spotlight? Let's talk. C.E. Barron smirked, shaking his head. He wasn't in a rush to be anything other than himself, but the world had taken notice. And whether he liked it or not, this was only the beginning. Barron stared at the message from Clint Eastwood for a moment before locking his phone and setting it aside. He wasn't in a rush to respond. He respected Eastwood, but he wasn't sure he wanted to step into any spotlight just yet. The world had already started crafting a narrative for him, one he hadn't asked for. Headlines speculated about his next move, political figures whispered about his potential, and social media users debated whether he was the next big name to watch. It was surreal, but also predictable. People always wanted a story. One afternoon, as he walked through the city, a man approached him outside a quiet bookstore. He was older, dressed in a well-tailored suit, and carried the air of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. Mr. Trump, the man greeted, extending his hand. Barron shook it, cautious but polite. Can I help you? I'm with a talent agency, the man said smoothly. We represent some of the biggest names in media, business, even politics. We'd love to discuss your future. Maybe a book deal, speaking engagements. You have a presence that I appreciate. Barron cut in, his voice steady. But I'm not interested. The man looked surprised. Are you sure? These opportunities don't come around often. The public is curious about you. This could be the perfect time to— I'm not for sale, Barron said, offering a polite but firm smile before walking past him. As he stepped into the bookstore, the air smelled of fresh pages and old wisdom. He preferred places like this, quiet, thoughtful, away from the chaos of public speculation. He picked up a book on leadership and flipped through its pages, considering everything that had happened in the past few weeks. The attention, the admiration, the expectations. It was all noise, just as his mother had said. He had no intention of letting the world push him into something before he was ready. When he finally responded to Eastwood's text, he kept it short. Appreciate the offer. For now, I'm just focusing on being myself. Minutes later, Eastwood replied, Smart answer. Stay that way. Barron smirked and slipped his phone back into his pocket. He wasn't playing anyone's game. He was writing his own story one step at a time, and whatever came next, he'd be ready. Months passed, and the buzz around Barron Trump slowly faded from the headlines, just as he expected. The world always moved on to the next big story, the next controversy, the next viral moment. But those who had been paying attention, the ones who truly understood power, influence, and legacy, hadn't forgotten him. One evening, Barron received an invitation. It was embossed on thick, high-quality cardstock, the kind that signaled exclusivity. No flashy logos, no unnecessary details. Just a simple message. Private gathering. Select guests only. Your presence is requested. Details to follow. There was no sender, no obvious indication of who had extended the invite. But Barron had a feeling this wasn't just another charity gala or networking event. It felt different. Intentional. He set the invitation down, considering it. Part of him was curious, but another part knew that stepping into rooms like this meant stepping into a world where everything had consequences. A few days later, a black car arrived at Trump Tower. No words were exchanged as Barron slid into the back seat. The driver nodded and pulled away from the curb, weaving through the city streets before arriving at an unmarked building in a secluded part of Manhattan. Inside, the atmosphere was unlike any event he'd attended before. There were no flashing cameras, no media presence, just a room filled with men and women who carried themselves like they made decisions that shaped industries, governments, and narratives. Barron recognized a few faces: CEOs, former world leaders, powerful media figures. But what caught his attention was the man standing near the fireplace, sipping a glass of whiskey. Clint Eastwood. The actor spotted him and smirked, raising his glass slightly in acknowledgement. Barron walked over, slipping his hands into his pockets. Didn't think you'd show, Eastwood said, his gravelly voice carrying just enough amusement. Barron shrugged. Didn't think you'd still be sending invitations. Eastwood chuckled. Kid, there's a reason people are watching you. You handled yourself once, and that was enough to make them wonder what else you're capable of. Barron glanced around the room. And who exactly is them? Eastwood leaned in slightly. The ones who write the script. Not just for movies, but for history. Barron studied him for a moment. He wasn't intimidated, but he wasn't naive either. He knew power when he saw it. So what do they want from me? He asked, keeping his voice even. Eastwood smirked. That's the real question, isn't it? He clapped Barron on the shoulder. Stick around, kid. You might just find out. Barron didn't move, didn't react. He just took a slow breath and let the weight of the moment settle in.